Hello and welcome to the Consider the Coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Jake Zabel of the St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia. We're joined again here on the Bible study couch for another Bible study. This Bible study we're going to be discussing the origins of the 12 apostles. So in this we're going to be talking about who were the 12 apostles and what they did and their early life before they were called by Jesus to come and be disciples and then later be appointed as apostles. Now we're going to just be discussing the original 12, so we won't be discussing Matthias who replaced Judas. Just a quick disclaimer before we start. The Bible doesn't give a heaps of information on all this, so some of this will be based on the minute information we do get out of Scripture. Other information will be coming from church tradition and what scholars think. So let's get underway with the origins of Simon Peter. So the first important piece of information to discuss is one that will relate to all of the 12 the disciples, and this is their age. See, in the Jewish culture, a man could begin work and get married around the age of 15, but they were not considered an elder until the age of 30, which is the age that Jesus began his ministry at. Since all of the 12 were considered working age men, we can conclude that they are older than 15. But since none of them are yet considered elders, we can also conclude that they would all have to be under the age of 30. Many scholars, however, believe that Simon Peter was the oldest of the disciples, probably in his late 20s. This is due to Simon's natural leadership and the assumption being then that he was the natural leader of the disciples because he was the oldest. Now, this disciple, Simon Peter, as we know, Simon is actually his birth name. Peter is the name that Jesus gives him, Peter meaning rock. Now, Simon is said to be the son of Jonah. And the fact that his name is Simon and not Simeon would imply that he is a Hellenistic Jew rather than a Hebraic Jew. Now this means that he is still a full-blooded ethnic Jew, but that his family had been Hellenized into the Greek culture and language, meaning that Simon Peter most likely spoke Greek on a day-to-day basis rather than Hebrew. Now some could conclude that his name actually was Simeon, and it's just the gospel writers who wrote in the Greek who decided to put his name down as Simon. However, there are a few reasons why this would not be the case. The first, and probably one of the most important, is that Simon's brother is named Andrew, or in the Greek, Andros, which is the Greek for man. It is actually a Greek name, meaning that Andrew is Hellenized. He has a Greek name, he doesn't have a Hebrew name. Thus it would make sense that Peter is also having the Greek version, not the Hebrew version of his name. Secondly, in Luke's Gospel, he does refer to the elderly prophet in the temple as Simeon, but then later refers to Simon Peter as Simon, demonstrating that the author, Luke, has made a conscious decision to refer to one using the Hebraic Simeon and one with the Hellenistic Simon. Now, Simon is called Simeon in two places in Scripture. The first is in Acts 15:14 and the second is in 2 Peter 1:1. Now in Acts 15, however, it is James the Just who calls Simon Simeon. And we know from the book of Acts along with the book of Galatians that James the Just was a strict observer of the Jewish law and the Jewish customs. James may have even been a Judaizer at some point. We can assume then that James, being such a strong Judaizer and so involved and dedicated to the Jewish culture and the Jewish laws, that he would prefer to refer to Simon by his Hebrew name Simeon rather than the Greek version Simon. This would be similar to how St. Paul in his epistles always refers to Simon Peter as Cephas, which is the Hebrew word for rock, rather than Petros, the Greek word for rock. Now as for 2 Peter, Peter does here call himself Simeon rather than Simon. Yet many scholars believe that Peter's second epistle was written to a Jewish audience. and that Peter would be using the Hebraic version of his name in order to have a better appeal to the Jewish audience. So based on all of this, we can safely assume that Simon Peter was a Hellenistic Jew rather than a Hebraic Jew. We could probably reinforce this by the fact that he grew up in Galilee, which was a heavily Hellenized area, and it was more common to find Hellenistic Jews in Galilee rather than Hebraic Jews. You could find Hebraic Jews up there, but they were less common. Now, as for Simon's early life, John 1:44 states that Simon came from the town of Bethsaida in Galilee. Now, we know little about Simon's family. Jewish custom was that a son would enter into the same profession as their father, and so Simon's family could have been fishermen. But the scriptures are silent on this matter. And it is possible that Simon and his brother Andrew simply got jobs as fishermen, because there was nothing else for them to do. This is probably reinforced by the fact that in John's Gospel, he is referred to as Simon of Bethsaida. Yet the Synoptic Gospels, that is Matthew, Mark, and Luke, all mention that Simon is living in Capernaum. This would mean that Simon most likely grew up in Bethsaida, being born in Bethsaida, but that he later moved to Capernaum for work. Now we can see a similar event which happened with Jesus. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, being born in Bethlehem, but growing up in Nazareth, and then Jesus is said to have moved to Capernaum and got a house there. It seems that Capernaum seems to be a bit more of a cultural hub with a bit more work available, and so it's very likely that Simon and his brother Andrew may have grown up in Bethsaida, but due to lack of work moved to Capernaum where they became fishermen. Now regarding the call of Simon, and here we can also include the calls of Andrew, James and John, they actually are called 3 times by Jesus. See, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John give 3 differing accounts. Yet these are not 3 different tellings of the same account. They are clearly 3 different accounts, because it's not like minor details are different. They are completely different events happening at completely different times. And so scholars have suggested that the disciples, especially at least these 4 disciples, were called on multiple occasions. Now, one piece of evidence to support the idea of multiple callings can be found when you compare Matthew and Mark's Gospel with Luke's Gospel. See, in Luke's Gospel, the calling of Peter takes place in Luke 5, while earlier in Luke chapter 4, Jesus is said to have gone to Simon Peter's house to heal his mother-in-law. Yet according to the accounts given in Matthew and Mark, the healing of Peter's mother-in-law only took place after those 4 had already been called by Jesus. This would then suggest that there are at least 2 different calling events. And if we look at the events mentioned in the Gospel of John, there is actually a 3rd different calling account. This would suggest that there are actually 3 different callings. Now, how these callings took place went like this. The first calling takes place in the Gospel of John, in which there are 2 disciples of John the Baptist who then decide to follow Jesus, and one of them goes and gets Peter and brings him along. Then we have the accounts of the Gospel of John, chapters 1 through to 4. And in these accounts, we also have the callings of Philip and Nathanael, the wedding of Cana, the Passover in Jerusalem, which includes the cleansing of the temple. There is the meeting of Jesus with Nicodemus. There is the meeting with the Samaritan woman. And then the wrap up with the healing of the official's son. Now, all of this takes place before the second calling of the disciples, which is mentioned in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. We know this because in John 5:54, John states that the healing of the official's son was the second miracle that Jesus had ever done. And yet the synoptics all mention that Jesus was casting out demons and healing the sick after he had called Simon, Andrew, James, and John. Thus, sometime after the account of John chapter 4, Jesus is walking by the Sea of Galilee and he sees Simon and Andrew out fishing. He calls to them and calls them to become fishers of men. He then also calls James and John as well. Following this event, Jesus then casts out demons and heals the sick, one of whom is Simon's own mother-in-law. This also demonstrates to us that Simon was married. he is the only one of the 12 disciples to be mentioned in Scripture as having been married. The others could have been married, but it does not mention that in Scripture. Now, according to Clement of Alexandria, Simon and his wife also had children, but they're never mentioned in the Scriptures. There is one legend from the 6th century that identified Saint Petronilla as being his daughter, but many scholars don't believe that's the case. Now, after this, Jesus then goes around preaching in synagogues, and on one occasion he gives a Sermon on the Mount. Following this, Jesus then gives another sermon on the coast of Gennesaret. And it's during this event, during this giving of this sermon, that Jesus climbs into Simon's boat to use it as a pulpit. And after preaching to the crowds, Jesus then instructs Simon, along with James and John who were with him, to cast out their nets, and they caught a miraculous amount of fish. So many fish that it began to break their nets. After this, Jesus then called them for a third time, demonstrating that they should no longer be fishermen, but fishers of men. And so that is the origins of Simon Peter. Let us continue now with the origins of St. Andrew. So St. Andrew, he is also the son of Jonah, and also was born in Bethsaida, since John refers to Bethsaida as being the town of Simon Peter and Andrew. That is the town they grew up in. Andrew is the younger brother of Simon Peter. Now, tradition says that he was round about 5 years younger than Peter. Now, that's not mentioned in the Scriptures, but church tradition says that. Now, Andrew either had his own house in Capernaum, or he lived with his... Let's start over. Now, so, Andrew is also mentioned to be a son of Jonah, and he is also mentioned to have been raised in Bethsaida. However, like his brother Simon, Andrew moved to Capernaum, where he became a fisherman. Now, Andrew may have had his own house in Capernaum, and more likely, he could have lived with his brother Simon and his family. Or it is also even possible that Andrew lived with his employer Zebedee in some kind of employee quarters. Now, Andrew's background is very much the same as Simon's, except that sometime prior to the baptism of Jesus, Andrew and an unknown disciple, possibly the Apostle John, they became disciples of John the Baptist. Now, following Jesus' baptism, Andrew and this other man stopped following John the Baptist, and they decided to follow Jesus, whom Andrew confesses is the Messiah. Now, this is actually something of great importance and significance. For many people know of Simon Peter's great confession in Matthew 16:16, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Yet many people overlook the fact that Andrew, Simon's younger brother, confessed, "We have found the Messiah," much earlier. Andrew is the first of the 12 to confess that Jesus is the Messiah, that Jesus is the Christ. Andrew then accompanies his brother Simon and the others on the same events that I mentioned in the origins of Simon Peter. Essentially, Andrew is a follower of John the Baptist. He sees Jesus be baptized. He and this other disciple, possibly John, decide to then follow Jesus. Andrew then decides to bring his brother Simon along, and then we have the events of John chapter 1 through to John chapter 4. Then there's a second calling of Simon, Andrew, James, and John. Then there's some more healing events. There's a healing of Simon, mother-in-law. Then there's the event in which Jesus gives the sermon in Peter's boat, and then there's the miraculous catch of fish, after which Simon, Andrew, James, and John are called again for the third time. That wraps up the origins of Andrew. Let us continue now with the origins of St. John. Now, John is the younger son of Zebedee and Salome. Some scholars believe that Salome was Mary's sister, and henceforth the disciples James and John would have been first cousins with Jesus. Now, John traditionally is considered to be the youngest of the 12 disciples, possibly in his early 20s or late teens. Due to the fact that John's Gospel says that he is known to the high priest, this would suggest that John and his brother James were Hebraic Jews. See, John's brother James is also called Jacobus in the Greek, suggesting that this is a Hebrew name. Now, some scholars think that John and James were both born in Bethsaida, as well as Andrew and Simon. However, John worked for his father Zebedee, and they seem to live there in Capernaum, so it's possible that John and them actually just grew up in Capernaum. Now, scholars believe that Zebedee was rather wealthy, and that he ran a much larger fishing network. This is based on the fact that he had at least 2 boats. One boat that he sailed, and one boat that was sailed by Simon Peter. And also, in John 18:15, it says that Zebedee's son, John, is known to the high priest, suggesting a high social status. Now, other things could suggest this is... Now, one other thing that could suggest this is the fact that John authors several New Testament books, showing that John was highly educated. Therefore, this meant that his family was wealthy enough in order to afford such an education. Also, in Matthew's Gospel, John's mother comes to Jesus and she asks Jesus whether James and John can sit on his right and his left in the kingdom of God. Mark's Gospel actually has James and John asking this themselves, although Matthew's Gospel is the one that says that their mother asked on their behalf. And since the book of Acts shows that the disciples at this point in time still thought that Jesus was going to establish an earthly kingdom, this means that they were thinking that they could be set up as nobles in the earthly messianic Israelite kingdom. Now, the fact that James and John, or at least James and John's mother, would make such a request to Jesus would suggest that they already are familiar with having a high social status. This is something very important to consider, because you often hear people talk about how Jesus had simple, uneducated fishermen be his disciples. Now, this statement is somewhat incorrect. Now, the statement does hold true when we talk about guys like Andrew and Simon. They were employees of Zebedee. And in 1 Peter 5:12, it mentions that Simon Peter had a scribe write his epistle for him, demonstrating that Simon most likely couldn't read or write. Yet James and John were not simply uneducated fishermen. Since John could write so many books, it demonstrates that James and John were educated, that they were sons of a wealthy fisherman, and they were considered part of the upper class, being known to the high priest. It is possible that John was a disciple of John the Baptist, because it is possible that John was a disciple of John the Baptist before he became a disciple of Christ. This all depends on the identity of the unnamed disciple in John chapter 1. As I mentioned in the Origins video on Andrew and an unnamed disciple were followers of John the Baptist before they became followers of Jesus. The most likely candidate for this nameless disciple is John himself. The reason for this is that it's John's Gospel, and John has the habit of not using his own name in his Gospel, simply referring to himself as the beloved disciple. There is another alternative, and that is that the nameless disciple could have been someone like Philip, and this is due to the fact that Philip is from Bethsaida and could have been friends with Andrew and Simon. Secondly, since Andrew went and found Simon and said, "We have found the Messiah," it could make sense that Philip went and found Nathanael saying, "We have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets wrote." This could suggest that the nameless disciple is actually Philip and not John. This is possible, and there's the possibility that the unnamed disciple could have been somebody else, even James. However, most scholars seem to accept that John is the nameless disciple mentioned in John 1. And so it is possible that Jesus first called Andrew, Peter, Philip, Nathaniel, and James and John, being called later. However, like I said, the most likely interpretation of the text is that John is this unnamed disciple, and that Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John are all called together, first in the first chapter Gospel of John, and then later again in the callings mentioned in the Gospels of Matthew and Mark and the Gospel of Luke. So that wraps up the origins of the disciple John. Let us continue on with our origins of St. James the Great. Now, James the Great, or James the Greater, is the elder son of Zebedee and the older brother of St. John. James is considered to be one of the oldest of the 12 disciples, only being a year or so younger than Simon Peter. Now, many of James's details are very similar to John's. James and John's the son of Zebedee. Zebedee is a wealthy fisherman who seems to own several fleets, and John is mentioned as having been known to the high priest. Likely James was known to the high priest as well, which would demonstrate that James and John had a higher social status, that they were kind of nobles in their society. Also, the fact that John could write several books of the New Testament would suggest that John, and we would also believe James, his older brother, are both educated men, knowing how to read and write. Also, in the Bible, in the Greek, James, which is the Latin, actually is given the name Jacobus in the Greek, which is Jacob. This demonstrates that James could most likely be a Hebraic Jew. Unlike Simon and Andrew, who are Hellenistic Jews, James and John were most likely Hebraic Jews, participating in the Jewish culture and possibly speaking Hebrew on a more regular basis, although since they were fishermen, they most likely knew Greek as part of the trade language. James and John seem to be able to write in Greek, shown by the fact that John can write numerous books of the New Testament in Greek. So James and John seem to be educated men. They seem to have come from a wealthy family, and that their father seems to own quite a substantial fishing network. Now, the exact calling of James is unclear, and this happens to do with the fact that James is never mentioned in the Gospel of John being called. As I've mentioned in the origins of Simon, Andrew, and John, there seems to be multiple calling accounts of these four disciples: Simon, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, where they get to be called on multiple occasions. However, James is never mentioned in the calling account in John's Gospel. Andrew is mentioned by name. An unnamed disciple is mentioned who is assumed to be John, and Peter, or Simon, is mentioned by name. James is not mentioned at this point. However, we can most likely conclude that he would have been also called at this point, for it would have been strange that he was the only one not called, and that he's only called much later after all the other disciples are called. So essentially, we can assume that James was called alongside Simon, Andrew, and John at the first calling in John 1, also at the second calling mentioned in Matthew and Mark, and also being present for the third calling in Luke 5. Now that wraps up the origins of James the Greater. Any more information I could mention on James we pretty much touched on in our origins of St. John. So let us continue with the origins of St. Philip. Now, Philip was a Hellenized Jew. He is said to have come from the same town as Andrew and Simon, that is the town Bethsaida. Now, the fact that John mentions Philip having come from the same town as Andrew and Simon suggests that Philip may have known Andrew and Simon. It is for this reason that some people think that it is actually Philip and not John who is the nameless disciple of John the Baptist mentioned in John 1. What we do know is that Philip is a Hellenistic Jew. We know this based on the fact that his name is Philip, a Greek name, based on Philip of Macedon, or Macedonia. Now, scholars believe that since Philip was born in Bethsaida, which was a fishing town, that Philip was also a fisherman. But since he is never connected with Zebedee's fleet, this means that either Philip was not a fisherman or that he at least didn't work for Zebedee. Now, church tradition says that Philip was in his mid-20s when called by Jesus and that he was actually a childless widower. Now, the Bible doesn't make any mention of Philip having a wife, but church tradition says that he was married and widowed prior to being called by Jesus. Now, depending on who is the nameless disciple of John the Baptist, it's either Philip or John. This means either Philip was called alongside Andrew or that he was called the next day when Jesus calls Philip and then goes and calls Nathanael. Jesus is then, that wraps up the origins of Andrew, and let us continue with the origins of Saint Nathanael Bartholomew. Now, in John's Gospel, Nathanael is said to have been a friend of Philip. The name Nathanael only appears in John's Gospel. In the Synoptic Gospels, Philip is always paired up with a disciple named Bartholomew. And this is believed, and it is believed that Nathanael and Bartholomew are actually the same person. Bartholomew simply means son of Tholomew. Thus, it is possible that his name was Nathanael Bartholomew, just as Simon is referred to as Simon Bar Jonah, Simon son of Jonah, Nathanael son of Tholomew. Since Nathanael is a Hebraic name and Jesus refers to him as a true Israelite, we can safely assume that Nathanael is a Hebraic Jew. This is reinforced by Nathanael's disdain for the town of Nazareth. Now, church tradition teaches that Nathanael was the second youngest disciple. He is also believed to have been the youngest of 7 children. Nathanael was unmarried, and he is said to have lived in Cana. See John 21:2, where he is called Nathanael of Cana. It is believed that Nathanael lived in Cana, where he cared for his sick and aging parents, according to church tradition. Nathanael was considered to be the second most educated member of the group, second only to Judas Iscariot. Now, as I mentioned in the origin videos on James and John, I mentioned how the fact that John knew how to write in Greek and the fact that Zebedee owns numerous ships and that they are well known to the high priest. We can also see that James and John were also educated men and that they too belonged to a higher status in society. Church tradition simply taught that Nathanael was also an educated man and that he was more educated than James and John, being the second smartest of the group. Now, church tradition holds that Nathanael was a merchant. It is possible that Philip was Nathanael's fish supplier, and this is how the two became friends. In John 21, Nathanael joins Simon Peter to go fishing, which demonstrates that Nathanael had at least a basic knowledge of fishing. Whether he was a fisherman himself, he at least knew the basics of the practice. Now, according to John's Gospel, after Jesus had called Philip, Philip ran and found Nathanael to tell him that they had found the Messiah. Nathanael and Philip then accompanied Jesus along with Simon, Andrew, James, and John as the first 6 disciples. Now, this wraps up the origins of Saint Nathanael Bartholomew. Let us continue with the origins of Saint Matthew / Saint Levi. Now, Matthew is the 7th disciple to be called in the scriptures, being called sometime after the 3rd calling of Simon, Andrew, James, and John. Matthew is a tax collector who lived in Capernaum, and he is believed to have been the child of tax collectors, since it was a typical Jewish custom to follow in the footsteps of your parents, just as Jesus became a carpenter after his adopted father Joseph the carpenter. This meant that Matthew worked directly for the Roman government, collecting taxes from the Jewish people to give to the Roman Empire. Now, in Mark and Luke's Gospels, Matthew is called the son of Alphaeus, who is also the name of the father of the disciple James the Lesser. So either Matthew and James were brothers, or their fathers simply had the same name. The fact that they are not listed as brothers in the Gospels, while Andrew and Simon and James and John are always referred to as brothers of each other, this would suggest that Matthew and James are not brothers. Their fathers just simply had the same name. Now, Matthew is called Levi in both the Gospels of Mark and Luke. Now, according to the Catholic Encyclopedia, his original name was Levi, and Matthew was the name given to him by Jesus when he became a disciple. This is based on the fact that Mark and Luke refer to him as Levi the tax collector during his calling, yet when they give the list of the 12 disciples, they always refer to him as Matthew, suggesting that he was originally called Levi and then later got the name Matthew after being called. Matthew also only refers to himself as Matthew the tax collector in his own gospel. This would signify that he chose to identify himself by his new name. Thus, we could safely assume that Matthew was actually born Levi and that he was renamed Matthew by Jesus. Or he may have just adopted a new name when he gave up being a tax collector and became a disciple. The fact that his name was Levi originally would suggest that he too is a Hebraic Jew. It is unknown from what town it is unknown where Matthew was born and lived. He was simply mentioned to have been a tax collector in Capernaum, so we could safely assume that he at least lived in Capernaum, if not having been born there as well. This wraps up our origins of St. Matthew / St. Levi. Let us continue on with the origins of St. James the Lesser. The name James the Lesser actually comes from the Gospel of Mark in Mark chapter 15, where James is mentioned there to be called James the Lesser. Wherever else James is referred to, he is always referred to as James the son of Alphaeus. As mentioned in our discussion on the origins of St. Matthew, Matthew's father was also named Alphaeus. However, since the Gospels never identify Matthew and James as brothers, we can safely assume that their fathers simply had the same names. In Mark 15, James is said to be the brother of Joseph and the son of the third Mary present at the crucifixion. In John 19, this Mary is referred to as Mary of Clopas, which a majority of scholars translate as Mary the wife of Clopas. This raises a question about whether James's dad was Alphaeus or Clopas. The Gospels are clear that his father is Alphaeus and that his mother's name is Mary of Clopas. There are two solutions to this one. One is that the phrase of Clopas could mean the daughter of Clopas rather than the wife of Clopas. Thus, Clopas is just James's maternal grandfather. The other and more popular position is that Alphaeus and Clopas are actually just the same figure, and these are just two different names for the same person. Now, some scholars believe that Mary of Clopas is the same woman as the sister of Mary, the mother of Jesus, although it would seem fairly odd for a family to have two daughters named Mary. Thus, Mary's sister and Mary of Clopas would most likely be different women. Or, Mary of Clopas is actually the sister-in-law of Mary and not the sister of Mary. That would make it Clopas is then the brother of Mary. Or there's a weird account in which they have two daughters named Mary, and that they simply had second names to distinguish between them, such as how Herod's sons were Herod Antipas, Herod Philip, Herod Archelaus, etc. Now, some scholars believe that the brothers of Jesus, Simeon, James, Judas, and Joseph, are actually Jesus' first cousins, the sons of Clopas and Mary, which would thus make James the Lesser a first cousin of Jesus. It was the church father Papias of Hierapolis who first identified Clopas and Alphaeus as the same person. And he taught that Mary, the wife of Clopas, was the mother of James, Simon, Judas, and Joseph. Although Papias also identifies James the Lesser with James the Just, the other James that appears in the Gospel of Acts, in the Acts of the Apostles, and the author of the Epistle of James. However, the book of Acts appears to make a clear distinction between James the Just and James the Lesser, making it clear that they are two separate figures. As I mentioned above, others believe that Mary of Clopas and Mary's sister are different women, and some propose that Salome, the mother of James and John, was the sister of Mary instead. This could also be why Salome asked Jesus to let James and John sit on the right and left of Jesus. If Salome is the sister of the Virgin Mary, this would make her the auntie of Jesus and would make James and John first cousins with Jesus. Thus it would make sense that they get to sit on the right and left of Jesus in his kingdom, being relatives of the king. So depending on who the sister of Mary was, then either James the Greater or James the Lesser is the first cousin of Jesus. Now, some scholars believe that the cousins of Jesus were Simon, James, Judas, and Joseph, and that James the Less, Thaddeus called Judas, and Simon the Zealot were all brothers. But Scripture never hints at such a possibility. Scripture, in fact, calls Thaddeus the son of James and not the son of Alphaeus or Clopas. It is unknown what trade James the Less served in before he was called as a disciple, but many have proposed that he also was a fisherman. It is also unknown where James was born or lived. And that wraps up the origins of St. James the Lesser. Let us continue with the origins of St. Labius Thaddeus, also known as Judas. So Thaddeus is called by many names in the scriptures. Often his name is shortened to Judas. As mentioned in previous origins, this has led many to identify Judas with the author of the Epistle of Jude and as the brother of James the Less, although sometimes thought to be James the Just. However, Luke 6 calls him James the son of John, and thus Thaddeus and James, However, Luke 6 refers to him as Thaddeus the son of James, and thus Thaddeus and James the Lesser are not brothers. The name Thaddeus only appears in Matthew 10 and Mark 3. Elsewhere, Thaddeus is referred to as Judas, which could suggest that his birth name was Judas, but that he was given the name Thaddeus by Jesus. However, the King James Version of Matthew 10:3, based on a certain Greek manuscript, refers to Thaddeus as Labius, whose surname was Thaddeus. Thus, it could be possible that his name was Labius Thaddeus, and that he was given the name Judas instead. Church tradition holds that Thaddeus was born in Paneas, a town in Galilee later rebuilt and renamed Caesarea Philippi by Herod Philip the Tetrarch. Thaddeus is also believed to have been a Hellenistic Jew. Church tradition also holds that Thaddeus was a farmer by trade. That wraps up our origins on St. Thaddeus. Let us continue with our discussions on St. Thomas. So Thomas, known as Thomas Didymus. The name Thomas is the Hebrew word toam, meaning twin. And in John 11:16, John 20:24, and John 21:2, Thomas is referred to as Thomas called Didymus. Didymus being the Greek word for twin. Now the fact that the other is called Thomas the twin demonstrates that he is indeed a twin. It is interesting to note that Jesus had at least two sets of brothers, Simon and Andrew, and James and John. Yet Thomas's twin is not called as one of the 12 disciples. Since Thomas' name is a Hebrew name and not a Greek name, we can assume that Thomas is a Hebraic Jew and not a Hellenistic Jew. Little more is known about Thomas and his life before being called by Jesus. Many different trades have been proposed for Thomas, including carpentry, stonemasonry, and fishing. It is unknown from what town Thomas was born or grew up in. And that ends our origins on St. Thomas. Let us continue with our origins on St. Simon the Zealot. Now Matthew and Mark refer to Simon as a Cananean. That is an inhabitant of the city of Cana. Thus Simon, like Nathanael, comes from the city of Cana. Some Bible translations, such as the King James Version, refers to Simon as a Canaanite. But this would mean that Simon would have to be a Canaanite and not a Jew. And since the scriptures make it clear that all of the 12 disciples were Jews, this can't be the translation. Bible translations such as the Tyndale Bible and also the Luther Bible instead translate it as Simon from Cana, or Simon the Cananean. Not a Canaanite, the pagan Gentiles that lived in the land of Cana before it was inhabited by Israel, but a Cananean, a person from the city of Cana. The Gospel of Luke and the Acts of the Apostles also refer to Simon as a zealot. Now the Zealots were an anti-Roman Jewish sect. The 1st century Jewish historian Josephus Flavius regards them as the 4th sect of Judaism, the other 3 being Pharisees, Sadducees, and the Essenes. The Zealots were founded by Judas the Galilean, the rebel leader mentioned in Acts 5:37, who had risen up in the days of the census of Quirinius. Josephus states that the Zealots believed it was wrong to pay taxes to Caesar, and that God was their only king, and that violence was justified in order to overthrow the Roman government. The Zealots were a very violent anti-Roman revolutionary group. If the Zealots existed today, we would consider them a terrorist organization. Now Simon's involvement in this group was not insignificant or a passing fad. The fact that Luke makes a point of calling Simon the Zealot about 30 years after he had become a disciple demonstrates that it was a well-known fact that Simon had been a zealot, suggesting a deep commitment to the group. Simon's inclusion in the 12 is very interesting when you consider it as a counterbalance to Matthew the tax collector. See, Matthew worked for the Roman government, collecting taxes for Caesar, while Simon was a terrorist seeking to overthrow the Roman government and opposed paying taxes to Caesar. Matthew was a government employee, loyal to the Roman Empire, and Simon was a violent terrorist who sought to establish an independent Jewish kingdom. Now, even though Simon would have given up his violent terrorist ways when he became a disciple, he most likely retained his nationalistic politics, whereas Matthew was probably an imperialist and a globalist, which goes to show that Christians, while united on doctrine, can differ in politics, insofar as politics do not go against the law of God. You know, Simon the Zealot being a Jewish nationalist and Matthew being a Roman globalist. Now, one church tradition held that Simon was a merchant, prior to joining the Zealots, and that he was born in Cana but later moved to Capernaum, much like many of the other disciples. Another church tradition teaches that Simon had been bitten by a snake and was healed by Jesus, who said to him, "You shall be my disciple." Like Simon Peter, since Simon the Zealot uses the Greek name Simon rather than the Hebrew name Simeon, we can assume that Simon the Zealot is a Hellenistic Jew. And that wraps up the origins of Saint Simon the Zealot. Let us wrap up our 12 disciples by looking at the origins of Judas Iscariot. Now, the last of the 12 disciples to be mentioned is Judas Iscariot. John 6:71 refers to him as the son of Simon Iscariot. The name Iscariot means man of Kerioth, a town located in southern Judea. Thus, it is believed that Judas is from Kerioth. This is unique, since all the other disciples were from the region of Galilee, excluding Matthew, James the Less, and Thomas, of whom we are unaware of their exact birthplace. Now, most scholars believe that Judas was the only Judean disciple amongst the 12. Some scholars believe that this may have led to Judas feeling prejudiced against the other 11 Galilean disciples, which in turn led to his betrayal, but that is merely speculation. While we cannot know for certain, Judas is most likely a Hebraic Jew. One church tradition holds that his family were Sadducees and that they had moved to Jericho. Judas becomes a disciple of John the Baptist before becoming a disciple of Christ, or as it is taught in church tradition. John's Gospel tells us that Judas was the treasurer of the 12 disciples, in charge of the money, buying supplies for the group, and this would suggest a higher level of education for Judas. Now, this is important since Matthew was the tax collector and would have had experience with handling money, yet Judas was chosen out of all the 12 to be the treasurer, which then leads many to believe that Judas was a businessman by trade who had experience with buying and selling. This would again reinforce the idea of Judas having a higher level of education. As I mentioned in our discussions on the disciple Nathaniel, as I mentioned in the discussions on the origins of the disciple Nathaniel Bartholomew, scholars believe that Nathaniel is the second smartest of the 12 disciples, second only to Judas, meaning that Judas was actually the most educated of all the 12. And that wraps up the origins of Judas Iscariot. So, what we can learn from looking at the origins of the 12 disciples is this: that Jesus had a wide range of followers: Galileans and Judeans, Hellenistic Jews and Hebraic Jews, those loyal to the Roman Empire and those who sought an independent Jewish nation-state, government employees and revolutionaries, wealthy and poor, educated and uneducated, businessmen, working class men, upper class nobles, lower class peasants, fishermen, farmers, merchants, tax collectors, and yes, even a terrorist. Now, the gospel is for all people, from all walks of life. As Paul says in Galatians 3:28, there is neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, for you are all one in Christ. Jesus' miscellaneous group of 12 disciples teaches that God doesn't care about our race or our culture, or our economic status or our social status, or our politics or our career. You are important to God because you are made in the image of God and Christ has died for your sins. These men were not only called to be followers of Jesus, but as apostles, preachers, and pastors. Jesus can call any man to serve in the office of the ministry. As the saying goes, Jesus does not call the qualified, but he qualifies the called. Regardless of your social status, your economic status, your cultural group, your politics, or your prior career, Jesus can call you to serve as one of his ministers of word and sacrament. Amen. And that wraps up my Bible study on the origins of the 12. I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I know it's a little bit long. I'm thinking that I might actually break this video up into 12 different parts and upload 12 different shorter videos for those who are more interested in sitting down and watching small bite-sized videos rather than sitting down and watching a very long 50-minute Bible study. So I thank all those who have taken the time to sit down and watch all 50 minutes. If you have friends that would be interested in this topic but you don't think would like to sit down and watch a full 50-minute Bible study, let them know that I will be posting small bite-sized videos, taking all of these 12 apostles and dividing them up and doing one video per each of the 12, which will be much smaller videos, which will be easier to digest by people who prefer shorter videos. So if you want to point people towards those videos, I would encourage you to do that. They'll be coming out in the near future. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.